Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Everyone knows this. A single man with a lot of money must need a wife. Every family believes he will marry one of their daughters. Mrs. Bennet, who has 5 unmarried daughters, is very eager to find husbands for them. One day, she hears some exciting news. A rich young man, Mr. Bingley, has bought a big house nearby. "Mr. Bennet, you must go and visit Mr. Bingley," Mrs. Bennet said eagerly. "You should invite him to visit us." "Why should I do that?" Mr. Bennet replied calmly. "You can go yourself. And why do you care so much about this Mr. Bingley?" "Oh, my dear, don't you see? He is single and very rich. What a wonderful opportunity for our girls. Please visit him." "I won't promise anything," Mr. Bennet said with a smile. "But think of our daughters, my dear. This could change their lives," Mrs. Bennet insisted. "If he decides to marry one of them, I will certainly give him my blessing," Mr. Bennet teased. "But I must say, our little Lizzie deserves a good word." "Oh, don't say that," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed. "Elizabeth is no better than the others. Jane is much more beautiful, and Lydia is so lively and fun. But you always like Lizzie the most." "They are all silly, like most young girls," Mr. Bennet said with a grin. "But Lizzie has more sense than her sisters." Jane was the eldest, and she was indeed the most beautiful. Elizabeth, or Lizzie, was the second daughter, known for her quick mind and sensible nature. Lydia, the youngest, was only 15 and full of energy. Though Mr. Bennet liked to tease his wife, he understood that meeting Mr. Bingley was important. So, soon after, he went to visit the young man. When Mrs. Bennet and the daughters heard about his visit, they were filled with joy and excitement, dreaming about what might come next. A few weeks later, everyone in the neighborhood went to a big ball in Meryton, a nearby town. The Bennet family was excited to meet Mr. Bingley, his elegant sisters, and his friend, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley was a handsome and friendly young man. His sisters were very fashionable, always dressed in the latest styles, but it was Mr. Darcy who caught everyone's attention. Mr. Darcy was tall, very handsome, and looked like a perfect gentleman. Soon everyone learned that he was extremely rich. However, as the night went on, people began to whisper about how proud and distant he seemed. Mr. Darcy did not speak much, and looked down on many people at the ball. In contrast, Mr. Bingley was warm and kind. He danced every dance and spoke to everyone with a smile. He even danced twice with Jane Bennet, who was clearly the most beautiful girl in the room. At one point, Elizabeth was sitting nearby and overheard a conversation between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. "Come on, Darcy," Mr. Bingley said cheerfully. "You must dance." "Certainly not," Mr. Darcy replied coldly. "I don't like to dance with women I don't know, and your sisters are already busy." "Oh, nonsense," laughed Mr. Bingley. "There are so many charming girls here, and many of them are quite lovely." "You are dancing with the only beautiful girl in the room," Mr. Darcy said, glancing at Jane Bennet. "Yes, Jane is the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Mr. Bingley agreed, smiling at her. "But one of her sisters is quite pretty, too," Bingley added. "Why don't you ask her to dance?" "Which one?" Darcy asked, looking around. His eyes fell on Elizabeth. "She's fine, I suppose, but not beautiful enough to tempt me." Elizabeth heard every word, and she felt anger rising inside her. Yet, at the same time, she couldn't help but find his words amusing. When the Bennet family returned home that evening, Jane confessed to Elizabeth that she liked Mr. Bingley very much. "He is a wonderful man," Jane said softly. "He is intelligent, polite, and always so cheerful. He is also quite handsome," Elizabeth added with a playful smile. "I was surprised when he asked me to dance twice," Jane said shyly. "It's no surprise at all," Elizabeth replied. "You were the prettiest woman in the room." "Oh, dear Lizzie," Jane blushed. "And what did you think of Mr. Bingley's sisters?" Elizabeth asked. "They were very polite and friendly. I think they will make good neighbors." Elizabeth, however, had a different opinion. Though the Bingley sisters were from a respectable family and were very fashionable, she found them proud. They liked to think highly of themselves and looked down on others. Everyone believed that Mr. Bingley truly enjoyed dancing with Jane. The people in the neighborhood began saying how kind and charming Mr. Bingley was. Elizabeth noticed that Jane was beginning to fall in love with him. However, nobody liked Mr. Darcy. His pride and arrogance made people avoid him. But as Mr. Bingley continued to show affection for Jane, his sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, also became friendly with her. Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy started to notice Elizabeth more and more. Although he still thought she wasn't as beautiful as others, he now admired her intelligence and the sparkle in her eyes. One morning, Jane received a letter from Miss Bingley. She was invited to visit the Bingleys' house. "May I take the carriage?" Jane asked her mother. "No, dear. You should go on horseback," Mrs. Bennet replied. "I think it might rain soon, and if it does, Mr. Bingley will surely ask you to stay the night." "I would prefer to take the carriage," Jane said politely. "No, my dear," Mrs. Bennet insisted. "Your father needs the horses for the farm today." So Jane set off on horseback. As Mrs. Bennet predicted, it soon began to rain, and it continued to pour all day. That evening, Jane did not return home. The next morning, a letter arrived from Jane, explaining that the rain had made her very ill, and she had to stay at Mr. Bingley's house for a few days. "Well, my dear," Mr. Bennet said teasingly to his wife, "if our daughter dies, at least we will know it was your doing." "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Bennet replied cheerfully. "It's just a little cold. I'm sure it will be for the best if she stays there a few days longer." Elizabeth was worried for her sister and decided she must visit Jane immediately. "The distance is nothing," she said. "It's only 3 miles. I'll be back by dinner." Elizabeth walked to Mr. Bingley's house through the muddy roads. When she arrived, her shoes were dirty and her dress was damp. Everyone in the house was surprised by her decision to come on foot, but Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy were polite to her. Elizabeth decided to stay at the house for a few days to take care of Jane, who was very unwell. While she was with her sister, Miss Caroline Bingley started making fun of Elizabeth. In her eyes, Elizabeth and Jane were not from an important enough family. Their uncle was only a lawyer, which Caroline found beneath them. However, Mr. Bingley didn't care about their family's connections. To him, Jane and Elizabeth were lovely, kind women. But Mr. Darcy thought differently. He believed that their low connections would make it difficult for them to find a good husband. The Bennet sisters stayed at Mr. Bingley's house for a few more days, and during that time, Mr. Darcy found himself liking Elizabeth more and more. They often had interesting conversations, and even playful arguments. Mr. Darcy tried to spend more time with her, but Elizabeth kept avoiding him. She still thought Mr. Darcy was rather unpleasant, despite his attention. Caroline Bingley noticed Darcy's growing interest in Elizabeth, and she became jealous. Caroline wanted Mr. Darcy for herself, so at every opportunity she tried to make fun of Elizabeth, pointing out her faults. But Elizabeth did not care much for Caroline's opinion. Finally, Jane got better, and Elizabeth took her back home. Mr. Darcy was both relieved and troubled when Elizabeth left. He felt himself falling in love with her, but believed she was too simple for him to marry. He could not imagine himself being with someone from a family like hers. That evening, at dinner, Mr. Darcy spoke about his high social position and his friendship with Lady Catherine, a very important woman. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins, a distant cousin of the Bennets, had his own plans. He believed it was his duty to marry one of the Bennet sisters. At first, he thought of marrying Jane, but Mrs. Bennet quickly informed him that Jane was almost engaged. So Mr. Collins shifted his attention to Elizabeth and decided she would be his wife. The next day, Mr. Collins and the Bennet sisters went to the town of Meryton. The younger sisters were excited to go because they wanted to see the officers staying there. While in Meryton, they were introduced to a new officer, Mr. Wickham. He was a very handsome and charming gentleman with excellent manners, and the Bennet sisters were immediately impressed by him. As they talked with Mr. Wickham, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy happened to pass by. Elizabeth was surprised to see that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham clearly knew each other, and it was obvious they did not like each other. Their cold, distant looks made Elizabeth wonder what had happened between them. What could be the reason for their dislike?